Hi, everybody. Dr. Friedman here. It's week 9, and it's the week before spring break, so it's time for us to shift. We've been reading and playing and thinking and talking and learning so much, and now it's time to really take all the notes that we've taken, all of the observations we've made, all of the information we've collected, and figure out what to do with it. And over the last 2 weeks, we've been having that conversation with James D'Amato, Dylan Appelian, Quintin Smith, and looking to different models for how to write about play. We've looked at game journalism, we've looked at other ways of public speaking and thinking and writing, and we've been starting to draft based on play reports that students have been doing the entire time that the semester has been going. This week is a little bit interesting to recap because there's not a set text. Well, that's not true. On Monday, we actually took a look at a couple of different things. One is my notebook for 7-Part Pact UK. To show them the kinds of ways that I was taking notes, the ways I was keeping track as Hierophant, which is the player in charge of all the NPCs, how I was basically setting myself up to be able to document this in the future, both for the help of the designer, but also just so that I could remember in different kinds of ways. So taking all of this and knowing that I'm just one of 6 people that played that game, and as it turns out, for better and for worse, it's one of the most documented playtests of the game that has yet existed. And you can follow along with this assignment, friends, because what we did in class on Monday, after students had tried their first attempt at drafting about a game, is they read 3 layered blog posts, all of which are on the internet for you to read, although one does require a Patreon subscription. So we read in sequence, because this is the sequence in which they were written and published. Quintin Smith's fan club blog 18, I Played the 7-Part Pact, which was the first quasi-public discussion of this particular playtest. We then followed it up with Kieron Gillen's response, the 7-Part Pact, the first actual GM full game, which was written a little bit in parallel, but also in conversation with Quinz's report. In other words, it's taking a different angle, not just because of Kieron's different perspective, but also because of what was already publicly discussed. Finally, since rule of threes, we took a look at my post for one of my very first Patreon posts, which is the Lazy Professor's Guide to Organizing a 7-Part Pact. This is one of 2 pieces that I actually wrote about 7-Part Pact, the other being a lyric essay, but more on that in a hot second. What we did was I gave students time to read one blog post, pause, and then I said, what do you know about this game? This game you know nothing about, only from this post. So you can play along with at home, and I might put some timestamps into this. You can pause the video if you'd like to go and read the links down below. But I'm curious in the comments what you got out of each of these 3 posts. And of course, there's a lot more that's been written both about this playtest as well as about the 7-Part Pact. So let's go. My students read Quinn's essay and got intimidated. They were scared because this is an essay that focuses on how big this thing is. And that's a very true observation for how the game makes you feel. You are in charge of one set of rules and one part of the logic of this world, and you are hyper-focused on maintaining balance in that one field, which means that you are often, by design, completely oblivious to what's happening to the other players until you go to the wizard moot each month and try to convince your brother wizards to care. The images are overloaded. The cropping makes it clear that this is wall-to-wall stuff in all kinds of ways. And we don't get a kind of walkthrough. How could you, in the space allotted to any blog post, get to know a game that has multiple rule books, an entire grimoire, and more? And so the vibe is what Quinn's does best and what his essay really introduces. And I was able to say, because I know the audience response to these pieces, that indeed was, for many people, the takeaway that they had from Seven Part Pact, that this was brilliant and that this was a game that they might not ever dare to play. Kieron's actually gives you some of the rules. You find out, as my students note, the actual roles that you can potentially choose from in this game. A lot of the images are very similar, but you also get a sense of the kind of play state in a little bit more of an organized, and before it became chaos of beer and caffeine and amazing snacks. Kieron is focused, like many play reports, on a single mechanic, which is to say the fact that everyone at the table is a GM. And in fact, this isn't taking one GM's role and splitting it among up to 7 players. It is, in fact, 7 different theories of what GMing is, all coming into conflict. And that is the focus and the interest that Kieron has in this essay. And of course, Brian Flaherty has also written about this particular playtest, and I'm going to also include that link. What I wanted to include here were the 2 voices that they've either spoken to in the case of Quinn's, or that they will be speaking to in terms of Kieron. And of course, the one they have to deal with all the time, which is me. And I was able to, as an author, after they gave me feedback of, this is the one that seems the most practical, the most pragmatic. It is literally talking about what you have to do in order to play the game and set it up for your friends. And I said, yeah, because I had to, because that was my job. I was the one who did the logistical work for organizing this playtest. And there's lots that I didn't include, but to let people know that this is collective, that there's different kinds of ways in which logistics can be complicated, and to just kind of explain how this came about. There's a lot of misconceptions, interestingly, about this particular playtest because of how public the discussion of the game was. And this is kind of designed also to explain that, like, we had a different group of people originally, but as with many cases in, organizing a game, things happen, family intervenes, calamities develop. What was a superabundance of potential players dwindled down to 6. And we didn't have the ability to staff back up with people that were into this game, that were geographically close and that we could trust in the 48 hours we had before the game. Talking about Google Forms, talking about, like, how do you find the space, was just as important as me telling the story of what it's like to play my specific role of the Hierophant. But as I said to my students, and as I say to you, that's not necessarily always how I write. I'm deeply inspired by both Quinn's and Kieron's long history of game writing that we've talked about in class already, along with lots of other people who do really interesting work in the space, combining the personal in kind of autoethnography or auto theory kinds of ways to communicate how a game makes us feel. I couldn't do that with this piece, and so instead I read out a piece that is not publicly available, but I might make available on my Patreon soon, which is the seed of a new book that I'm working on after the next 2. Stay tuned for an announcement on that very soon. Where I use these kinds of play reports as this inspiration for lyric essays, for these kinds of ways of communicating gameplay and game emotion in a way that encourages you to want to play in different kinds of ways. So that was what we did on Monday. And today we're going to talk about methods in research. And I'm probably not going to recap that, as will become clear. I'm now increasingly under more tight deadlines than ever before, and I want to continue to provide some good salient content. But the number of times that I'm going to be camera ready and raring to go over the next little while is going to be a little bit less frequent. So I will tell you right now, the thing that we're doing today is we're going over resources to explore for the development of the UnEssay, starting with an annotated bibliography that is due the Friday after we come back from spring break. So students are going to have 2 weeks, 1 week of in-class class time in terms of time after spring break, so that hopefully they take some well-deserved rest, to find several good sources that they can annotate and say why they think they're useful, and I can give them feedback. And I want to start them off strong by showing them the different places that they can go look in terms of reliable peer-reviewed sources, reliable sources beyond the academy that they can go and do some hunting. So I have a link to those kinds of resources as well on my Patreon for free, because that's where I just kind of store stuff in a time when I don't have time to update my website until summer at some point. And but I want to make things easily available and searchable in different kinds of ways. So that link will also be below. I'm curious what questions you do have about what's going on. We're going to slow down a little bit in terms of recaps, because a lot of what we do now is student-directed workshopping, drafting, discussing. Although, as I will follow up with a short setting you an assignment, we are going to be reading Die, both the comic and the game, for the month after spring break. So there will be a little bit of a reading club available for you to follow along. More on that in a hot second. Until then, take care.